Good morning.
Good morning.
Can everyone hear me? I heard this microphone is a little sensitive. Good? In the back? Good? Okay. So my maternal grandmother, Jessie Lee Thompson, was quite a woman. And when I say quite a woman, I mean that in a few different ways. Grandma Jessie, or Grandma J as we sometimes call her, grew up in rural West Virginia on the top of a mountain. And despite then living in Chicago for over 60 years, she never completely lost her West Virginia accent. She'd say things like can't instead of can't, and now hush instead of be quiet. And she named her 1975 Chevy Malibu Bessie, I'm guessing after some childhood cow. She made the best pan-fried cornbread you can imagine, and she always prayed before meals. Always. Another thing she always did was wear lipstick. You never saw her out of the house without it, even in her 80s. And if I was wearing it, there was never a time when she didn't ask me why I wasn't wearing it, or if I was wearing it, why I wasn't wearing a brighter shade. This was a woman who took her looks very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that once when I was about 6, and she was responsible for picking my cousins and I up at Vacation Bible School on a very rainy day, she decided to put a Dunkin' Donuts bag on her head so that it wouldn't ruin her perfectly crimped hair. Now, my mom says I should be grateful it wasn't a pair of underwear, which apparently wasn't out of the question either. But Grandma Jessie was actually who came to mind when I read the scripture that Tiffany just read a few moments ago. In these verses, we read the Apostle Paul writing to Timothy, his protege, with words of wisdom and encouragement as he strives to live faithfully during a time of civil unrest. Paul is writing from prison where he is likely to die, so the letter is a sort of last testament. What strikes me about the opening verses is Paul's emphasis on the legacy of maternal faith as the guiding compass for Timothy's journey. The dominant patriarchal narrative of Christianity glosses over the major influence of these two women in Paul and Timothy's lives. But here Paul references them as the reason that he can know in his gut, even as he sits in a prison cell, that Timothy remains strong in his faith. And what's more, Paul says it's for this reason, because he stands on the shoulders of these two brave women, that he should remember and embrace the gift of God that dwells in him. Paul says, "For God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline." Not a spirit of cowardice, but of love, power, and self-discipline. This was Grandma Jessie. Because underneath the pink lipstick and puffy hair, beneath the West Virginia accent and the lack of social graces, was one of the most powerful, loving human beings I've ever met. This was a woman who in her early 20s left the comfort and familiarity of rural West Virginia life and moved to Chicago with her new husband in search of a better life. And when that same husband became an alcoholic and left her while she was pregnant with her third daughter, it was her strength, her Christian faith, and her deep love for her girls that carried her through while she worked second shift at a chocolate factory to make ends meet. Despite everything life threw at her, from debilitating arthritis to a lung disease that left her gasping for breath in her last days, Grandma Jessie remained fierce. She knew who she was, and she knew who she was. And she never doubted the Spirit of God at work in her life, providing her with power and love and self-discipline that she needed to live faithfully. She was generous with her hard-earned money, and she was surprisingly independent from a woman of her generation, deciding never to remarry after her husband left her in the early 80s. But of course, no one is perfect, including Grandma Jessie. And as I reflect on the legacy of faith that she passed on to her daughters and grandchildren, I'm reminded of the narrow and misinformed understanding we church folks often have of God's gift of power. Many Christians, my grandma included, see power as directly opposed to Christian commandments to be humble, seek peace, and lay down our lives for one another. Even though she was clearly a powerful woman who left a strong legacy of faith, Grandma Jessie would never have claimed to be powerful, and she would never have intentionally sought after power, especially power that operated in the public realm. She didn't recognize that power is actually a gift that allows us to love ourselves, our neighbors, and God in deeper and more faithful ways. There are many reasons that we church folks don't acknowledge or embrace God's gift of power as a means to love. First of all, many of us don't realize that power isn't actually a dirty word. Despite the fact that many corrupt folks are drawn to power, power in and of itself isn't a bad thing, just like Yasmin was saying. It's neutral. Like all other gifts from God, it can be used for good or evil. Thinking of the Spanish word for power, poder, we sang a minute ago, can be helpful here. The literal translation of power is to be able. Power is agency. It's simply the ability to do something. Another reason that we often don't embrace God's gift of power is because we internalize systemic oppressions. Racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, and all the other isms that tell us that our voice doesn't matter. Our experience doesn't matter. We don't have what it takes to be all that God created us to be. My grandma was an example of this. For all her personal strength and fierce independence, she internalized the church and the world's sexist ways. For example, she didn't think women should be pastors. Anytime she'd read a sermon I wrote, she'd always tell me she enjoyed my talk, because she just couldn't bring herself to call it a sermon. Many of us resist acknowledging the role of power in any given situation because we recognize that with power comes responsibility. If we have the ability to act, then we must act. We must take action toward our personal liberation and flourishing, as scary and risky as that can be. And we must take action toward our collective liberation, even if it means facing conflict and controversy and working to dismantle our own privilege. In this country, certain skin tones, genders, economic classes, abilities are privileged more than others, to say the least. And it can be especially hard for those of us with multiple privileges to acknowledge the power dynamics at play. If we acknowledge power, then we might have to acknowledge the disproportionate amount of power society has given us.
Right.
And if we acknowledge the disproportionate amount of power we hold, then we might feel compelled to share it. Now, some of us don't embrace God's gift of power because we fear conflict. We don't want to rock the boat or have others think less of us. We forget that Jesus says, "Woe to you when the world speaks well of you." In the words of Lutheran pastor and community organizer Dennis Jacobson, Jesus had enemies. Jesus was controversial. Jesus turned tables upside down and confronted principalities and powers. Obedience to Jesus and to our conscience often takes us places we may prefer not to go. This was especially true for Paul, whose faithfulness to the way of Jesus landed him in prison twice and ultimately resulted in his death. And one of the main reasons Paul was such a threat to the authorities is because he embraced God's gift of power and knew it was meant to be shared, especially with those on the margins. One of the other main reasons we fail to embrace God's gift of power is because of the many times and many ways we've seen it abused. When I was a college student in Chicago, I volunteered at an overnight shelter for homeless men. The shelter was run by an evangelical church, and if the men wanted to stay at the shelter for the night, they had to arrive by 7 p.m. sharp, in time for dinner and Bible study. Now, unfortunately, the guests couldn't eat dinner without also participating in the Bible study, even if they didn't care to. This wasn't an explicit rule, but the reality was that the basement room where the dinner was held and the Bible study was held was really small. You couldn't avoid hearing what was being taught. Also, the man in charge of the shelter, the man who decided whether you could stay or go for the night, was also the man who led the Bible study. So you really wanted to stay on his good side. One evening, the man in charge was teaching a Bible study on capital punishment. I don't remember what Bible verses he was using to make his point, but almost 20 years later, I can remember how arrogant and dogmatic he was in making his point that the Bible condones state-sanctioned execution. In response to his lesson, one young African-American man raised his hand and said, "But wait, I thought we learned last week that Jesus said you should forgive your brother 70 times 7 times. An astute point, I thought, but the white man in charge disagreed. He quickly and rudely shut this young man down and reiterated the point that the Bible supports the death penalty. I left the shelter that evening and never went back. I was sick with this man's abuse of power. It wasn't his views on capital punishment that bothered me, even though I disagreed with him. It was his blatant disregard for this young man's earnest faith and lived experience. By shutting him down in such a harsh manner, the man in charge was exercising his power over this young man instead of using his power with this man. He was sending yet another message to this young black man that his voice didn't matter, that the gifts he had to offer weren't welcome. This experience put a fire in my belly. It's what led me to work for several years as a faith-based community organizer, and what sparked in me a passion for helping others recognize and live into their God-given power, especially those whom society silences. It's also why I ended up at seminary. I was hungry for a theology that had more to say about Jesus' death on the cross than just that it saved us from our sins. I wasn't interested in a God who views us as depraved creatures and demands a death as payment for wrongdoings. I was, however, interested in a God whose life, death, and resurrection were, among other things, an exercise in shared power and a demonstration of a love that knows no bounds.
Amen.
My years in seminary and as a community organizer have helped me understand power in a profoundly different way than I used to. First of all, I've come to understand that power is our birthright. If God created human beings in God's image, then it follows that human beings have the power to act, the power to create, the power to effect change. The concept of the Imago Dei, or the image of God, has become central to my theology and fuels my work for justice. If each person is created in the divine image, then each person has inherent dignity. Each person has the right to the basic resources they need to flourish. And if each of us has power, then we all must use that power to ensure the image of God in others doesn't lie dormant, but instead is nurtured to its fullest potential. As for Jesus' death on the cross, I no longer see it as a payment for our sins or as an expression of divine selflessness that we must constantly strive to emulate. As Dennis Jacobson says, the point of the cross is not that Jesus abandons power or condescends to enter our suffering, or as an act of divine commiseration, but rather to set us free from bondage to sin and death, to release power within us that we might break the chains of oppression and be liberated. J. Diotis Roberts puts it simply in Black Theology and Dialogue when he says, God enters into self-limitation in order to share power with human beings. God enters into self-limitation in order to share power with human beings. Understanding power in the cross this way was revolutionary to me. God is not primarily concerned with our personal sin through the cross and resurrection, but about releasing a power within us that has the ability to create, to liberate, to bring about a new reality. I refer to this kind of power as spirit power. Spirit power is radically different than the abusive power and unilateral power that often operates in the church and the world. Spirit power is unifying. It takes others' interests into account as much as it takes its own interests into account. It doesn't see power as a zero-sum game. Spirit power is generative, creative, bigger than the sum of its parts. And above all, spirit power is grounded in love. Love for self and love for neighbors. Spirit power recognizes that power and love go hand in hand. As Martin Luther King Jr. says, power without love is reckless and abusive. But love without power is sentimental and anemic. I suspect that many of us at Valiant Mountain are at least somewhat comfortable with the idea of power as a means to love our neighbors. Valiant Mountain's commitment to inspiring and equipping people to become agents of God's liberating spirit was one of the main reasons I was drawn to this church. At Valiant Mountain, we embrace the idea of building power to bring about immigrant justice or to interrupt construction of a new youth jail. We recognize that love doesn't just occur in personal relationships, but is also meant to be shared in the public arena. When we demonstrate our power in front of the regional ICE headquarters by turning over tables and singing songs and sending messages to the ICE director, that's power as love for our neighbors. When we call our elected officials demanding they halt construction of a $223 million youth jail, that's power as love for our neighbors.
Yeah.
And when we exercise our power as a way of loving our neighbors, when we work for justice and peace, power also becomes a means of loving God. One of my favorite Bible passages that demonstrates how exercising power in the public arena can be a form of loving God comes from the book of Isaiah, chapter 58. In these verses, the divine is quoted as saying, "Is this not the fast I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer, and you shall cry for help, and he will say, here I love these verses because not only do they demonstrate that loving God means undoing oppression, but also because they demonstrate the interconnectedness of power, love for neighbor, and love for self. These verses make the point that when we work for the liberation of others, we experience liberation and healing ourselves. When we work to loose the bonds of injustice and let the oppressed go free, then our light shall break forth and our healing shall come quickly. I mentioned earlier that many folks have difficulty embracing divine power for themselves, and that there are numerous reasons for this, including internalized oppression. For me, this played out in my own formation growing up in a conservative evangelical church, where we were taught, especially we women, that faithfulness to Christ meant sacrifice and humility and always putting others' needs ahead of our own. Many of my fellow female seminary students at Duke had similar experiences, and I was amazed how many of them had difficulty embracing their power and their authority. I used my final thesis as an opportunity to explore the pattern I seemed to be noticing around me, and I'll never forget one interview I did with a 50-year-old student. I asked the student, as I did in all my interviews, if she saw herself as smart. And very quickly she replied, "No, I wouldn't say that." Friends, this was a woman who previous to her time at Duke was a partner in a law firm. These kinds of experiences break my heart. Each of us has been given a gift of divine power, not just as a means of acting for others' well-being, but also to love ourselves and to realize our fullest potential. Jesus' command to love our neighbors as ourselves suggests that he assumes and expects that we're going to be loving ourselves. We need to embrace God's power at work within each of us as a means for our own liberation, while we're also working for others' liberation. Each of us is worthy. Each of us has a voice that needs to be heard and gifts that need to be shared. If power is the ability to act, then we must use our God-given power to take action on our deepest dreams and our deepest hopes, and to become our most authentic selves. Fully acknowledging and embracing our power as a means to love ourselves, our neighbors, and the divine is hard work. That's why we need each other. We gather each week to be reminded that we belong to God and we belong to each other. We gather to foster community with one another so that we can encourage each other, challenge each other, work for justice together, and call out the gifts that we see in one another. I want to close with the words of Marianne Williamson, which Nelson Mandela made famous in his inaugural speech. Williamson writes, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people don't feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine as children do. We are born to make manifest the glory of God within us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone." Amen.
Do two or three people want to shout out just really briefly something that stuck out to you? Like 2 or 3 people, just really briefly, what's something that stuck out to you from Christa's reflection? So we can all hear.
That we can be powerful even if we don't recognize it.
Anyone else want to share something that stuck with you?
We got the rest of the around where she's at now.
Lipstick actually really does make us powerful.
So we know about it. Right, John?
Not all of that. Tried that. Freddie actually took me to a drag show this weekend on a date, and talk about empowerment. Yeah, people breaking through barriers, and it was actually, people, it seemed like the room was just full of awareness of their own power after being cut off for a long time. I love that poder that you pointed out, that we are able, that power that we have within us that's so often clamped down. Actually, a gentleman came in, some of y'all know, our friend around here, Vern, came in to get some water and then was leaving. And I thought he was just getting some water or something. But as you were speaking, you said, loving God means loving our neighbor as ourselves. And he hit himself on the heart and said, amen. He walked out of here. And that's a reminder of how hard that is. It sounds like an easy thing to do, and it's like the most basic message of the Jesus movement, and yet it is so hard to do that. To realize that loving God means loving our neighbor as ourselves, to love our neighbor, to love ourselves, because the world constantly is invested in teaching us that we are unworthy, that we should be ashamed, that we should hide our faces and put a lid on ourselves, but clamp down on the fire that burns within us. We're about to go into the ritual of communion, the sacrament of communion, and I believe that at its heart, the sacrament of communion is trying to break free from that cage that is put over this divine light inside us. It's a reminder of God's grace, that you are loved not because of what you've done, or how pretty you are, or how smart you are, or how good you are, or what you believe, but simply because that is the nature of God in this universe. It is overflowing, unconditional, and infinite love. And so we don't have to be afraid anymore of being good enough, of being blank enough. And so I think that Jesus left us with this and this movement to remind us. This is a practice to do again and again and again, to remind us that we are loved, that grace is available, and that we can be free to let that light burn. And when many, many little lights and little candles burn, a great conflagration, a great wildfire can begin.
Friends, each of you holds within you God's gifts of power, infinite power, and infinite love. Go out this week and hold on to that power, hold on to that love. Embrace that gift of power from God as a way to more deeply love yourself, love your neighbor, and love God. Amen.